As the sun sets on the annals of history, it casts a long, dark shadow over some of its most harrowing chapters. Among these are the grotesque human experiments conducted under the guise of scientific progress and warfare. These abominations of human curiosity and cruelty span continents and eras, leaving behind a legacy of pain and horror. Imagine, if you dare, the year 1941 in the depths of Auschwitz, where Dr. Josef Mengele, known infamously as the Angel of Death, orchestrated a series of cruel experiments on prisoners. His twisted fascination with twins led him to subject these siblings to inhumane procedures, seeking to unravel the mysteries of genetics with a scalpel drenched in cruelty. Across the ocean, in the land of the rising sun during World War II, Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, carried out brutal experiments on thousands of Chinese and Russian prisoners. Led by General Shiro Ishii from 1937 to 1945, these acts involved vivisections, weapon testing, and exposure to lethal pathogens. The screams echoing from the Pingfang district, where the unit was based, still haunt the pages of history. Further south, in South Africa during the late 20th century, the Aversion Project under the apartheid regime subjected homosexual individuals to forced conversion therapies, including chemical castration and electric shock therapy. Led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, this dark chapter from the 1970s to the 1980s sought to correct homosexuality, inflicting deep psychological and physical scars on its victims. In our journey through this grim historical episode, we face the appalling nature of these experiments and a shocking indifference to the suffering inflicted. Author and activist Helen Keller once said, "Science may have found a cure for most evils, but it has found no remedy for the worst of them all, the apathy of human beings." What led these individuals to perpetrate such dreadful and reprehensible acts? Join us as we explore the sinister world of human experimentation, piecing together the fragmented stories of the victims and confronting the disturbing truth that sometimes the most horrifying monsters wear the masks of healers. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. Echoes of darkness, the haunting legacy of Nazi medical atrocities. In the grim epoch of World War II, an unspeakable narrative unfolded under the Nazi regime, marking a dark chapter in human history. This was a period where medical ethics were obliterated and human lives were reduced to mere variables in a cruel equation of experimentation. The concentration camps, infamous for their brutality, became the settings for these sinister trials. Auschwitz, under Dr. Josef Mengele's reign of terror from 1943 onwards, witnessed some of the most barbaric experiments. Mengele, an ardent advocate of the Nazi racial ideology, conducted experiments on twins with a cold, scientific curiosity that belied a complete absence of empathy. His fascination extended to those with heterochromatic eyes, attempting to artificially replicate this condition through painful injections directly into the eyes of his victims. His aim, ostensibly, was to unravel the secrets of multiple births to boost the Aryan birth rate. Yet his methods were devoid of any shred of morality. He subjected twins to unimaginable tortures, transfusions of blood from one twin to another, and barbaric surgeries without anesthesia. The majority of these twins, primarily children, perished in agony, their bodies then dissected for further study. This Angel of Death, as he came to be known, often remarked casually on his research, once stating, "The more we do to you, the less you seem to believe we are doing it." Mengele's obsession wasn't confined to twins. He conducted experiments on dwarfs and people with physical abnormalities, driven by a twisted desire to understand and manipulate human genetics. His name became synonymous with terror among the camp prisoners, a spectre of death lurking in white medical attire. In Dachau, the infamous Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted equally horrific experiments under the pretext of military research. Between 1942 and 1943, he led a series of hypothermia studies. Prisoners were submerged in icy water or left naked in the freezing cold to determine how long German pilots might survive in similar conditions. His notes, chilling in their clinical detachment, detail the body's gradual shutdown in excruciating detail. Rascher's correspondence with Heinrich Himmler, in which he described his freezing experiments, reflects a disturbing disregard for human life. One prisoner, forced into a tank of ice water, is reported to have calmly smoked a cigarette as he slowly froze, a testament to the extraordinary resilience and defiance of the human spirit. Rascher also experimented with coagulants, attempting to devise a quick treatment for gunshot wounds. Prisoners were deliberately wounded, and untested drugs were administered, often leading to severe complications or death. In Buchenwald, the name Dr. Erwin Dingschuler stands synonymous with medical terror. From 1941 to 1945, he spearheaded experiments where prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus to test the efficacy of various vaccines. The morbidity and mortality rates were astronomical, yet Dingschuler noted these outcomes with a bureaucratic indifference. One survivor, recalling the horror, described how the screams of the victims could be heard throughout the camp. These experiments were not the pursuit of science, they were acts of barbarism, veiled in the language of research. Each of these experiments, devoid of compassion and humanity, was justified under the warped Nazi ideology of racial purity and military necessity. The victims, often Jews, Roma, or political prisoners, were dehumanized, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the Aryan race. As one survivor recounted, "They didn't see us as humans, we were just objects to them." These words echo the profound dehumanization characteristic of the Nazi regime. The legacy of these experiments extends beyond the immediate horror and suffering. The Nuremberg trials, which brought some of these war criminals to justice, also highlighted the profound ethical breaches in these experiments. The trials led to the formulation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of research ethics principles for human experimentation. One of the judges at the trials, Charles Beals, remarked, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts." Shadows of Harbin, the grim saga of Unit 731. In the annals of wartime atrocities, few chapters are as chilling as the story of Unit 731, a covert chapter written in the shadows of the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. This unit, a clandestine ensemble nestled in the outskirts of Harbin, China, became the epicenter of some of the most inhumane experiments ever conducted under the guise of scientific research. Unit 731, led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and a military officer, embarked on a ghastly journey into human experimentation that blurred the lines between science and sadism. Established in 1936, the unit operated under the innocuous name of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Yet, behind this veneer of public health, a sinister plot unfolded, one that disregarded all notions of morality and ethics. The facility, sprawling over 6 square kilometers, was a state-of-the-art complex comprising various laboratories, prisons, and testing areas. Within these walls, prisoners of war and civilians, primarily Chinese and Russian, were subjected to experiments that haunt the conscience of humanity. One of the most gruesome experiments involved vivisection without anesthesia. Prisoners, referred to not by name, but by the dehumanizing term maruta or logs, were infected with diseases such as plague, cholera, and typhus. Doctors then dissected these live victims to study the effects of these diseases on the human body. The chilling detachment of the personnel involved was epitomized in the words of a unit member who once coldly remarked, "Cutting open a screaming maruta was no different from slicing into a loaf of bread." The frostbite experiments conducted by the unit were equally harrowing. Victims were subjected to the harsh winters outside Harbin, their limbs left to freeze. Subsequently, these frostbitten extremities were studied, often involving amputation without anesthesia. The inhumanity of these experiments was not lost on the perpetrators. Ishii himself once remarked, "For the sake of Japan's victory, I wouldn't hesitate to do anything." Perhaps one of the most horrifying aspects of Unit 731's activities was the development of biological weapons. Prisoners were used as living test subjects for pathogens. One of the most notorious incidents involved the dropping of ceramic bombs filled with plague-infested fleas over Chinese cities such as Ningbo and Changde in 1940 and 1941, leading to epidemic outbreaks. These experiments were not merely scientific pursuits, they were tests of terror aimed at gauging the effectiveness of biological agents as weapons of war. Unit 731's personnel carried out their grim work with a chilling efficiency and detachment. Shiro Ishii, the architect of this nightmare, once stated, "A doctor's God-given mission is to block and treat disease, but the work I am doing now is exactly the opposite. It's diabolical." His acknowledgement of the malevolent nature of his work underlines the moral abyss into which these scientists had plunged. The ethical vacuum within which Unit 731 operated is further exemplified by their testing of various chemical weapons on prisoners. Phosgene and cyanide, among other deadly gases, were tested for their lethality in different conditions. The indifference towards human life was starkly evident in the words of a Unit 731 surgeon who once stated, "The logs scream when you cut them. I stopped caring." The sheer scale and brutality of the experiments conducted by Unit 731 remain unparalleled. The estimated number of victims ranges from 3,000 to 12,000, although the exact number may never be known. The victims were not just subjects of experimentation, they were dehumanized in the most extreme ways imaginable, reduced to mere tools in the pursuit of a twisted vision of scientific progress. As the war concluded, the imminent threat of exposure led to the systematic destruction of the Pingfang facility. In their final act of cruelty, the remaining prisoners were executed and documents were burned. The Japanese forces left behind a legacy of death and a profound moral abyss. Shiro Ishii's surrender in 1945 did not immediately bring justice. In a controversial decision, many researchers from Unit 731 were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their data on biological warfare. The stories of the victims, silenced and buried for decades, only began to surface in the late 20th century, revealing the extent of the atrocities committed. Invisible scars, the shadowy world of Cold War radiation experiments. In the uneasy years following World War II, as the Cold War loomed large, a series of clandestine human radiation experiments began under the direction of the US government. These experiments, veiled in secrecy, involved unsuspecting American civilians and military personnel, marking a dark chapter in the annals of scientific research. The quest for nuclear dominance and the burgeoning field of atomic medicine intersected in these experiments, leaving behind a legacy of ethical breaches and human suffering. The genesis of these experiments can be traced back to the late 1940s, when the US Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, spearheaded efforts to understand the effects of radiation on the human body. Among the most notorious was the plutonium injection trials. At Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, and other facilities, patients like Albert Stevens, later identified as Cal-1 in AEC documents, were clandestinely injected with plutonium. Stevens, mistakenly believed to be terminally ill, became the unwitting subject of a study tracking plutonium's movement through his body. Injected in 1945, he outlived the prognosis, unknowingly carrying the radioactive burden for 20 years. In Cincinnati, the shadow of these experiments loomed large at the Cincinnati General Hospital. From 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Senger, ostensibly researching cancer treatment, exposed over 90 patients, predominantly poor and African American, to whole-body radiation. These individuals, unbeknownst to them, were part of a military-sponsored study. The ethical transgression of such an experiment was stark, as one participant later expressed, "We were like guinea pigs. They used us." The scope of these experiments extended to the environment as well. The 1953 Green Run operation at the Hanford site in Washington released radioactive iodine and xenon to simulate a nuclear meltdown. This covert test exposed nearby communities to significant radiation levels, all under the guise of national security. The public, kept in the dark, became unwitting participants in a hazardous experiment. Nuclear weapons testing in Nevada and Utah during the 1950s and 1960s also became a part of this grim narrative. Communities living downwind of these tests, later termed downwinders, experienced heightened levels of radiation. Despite government assurances of safety, the prevalence of cancer and birth defects in these areas painted a different picture. A downwinder affected by the testing lamented, "We were patriots, but they betrayed us." The military was not exempt from these experiments. Soldiers, labeled as atomic veterans, were positioned near nuclear blast sites to gauge their ability to operate in a post-nuclear environment. Many of these soldiers, exposed to high levels of radiation, later suffered from various radiation-induced ailments. Their plight remained unrecognized for years, their sacrifices hidden beneath layers of classified information. The ethical dilemmas of these experiments were profound. Informed consent, a cornerstone of ethical research, was conspicuously absent. As a government scientist involved in these experiments later reflected, "What we did then was wrong, but we thought it was right. It's a paradox that haunts us." The revelation of these experiments in the latter part of the 20th century sparked public outrage and led to a reckoning with the past. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established in 1994 by President Bill Clinton, sought to bring these stories to light. The committee's 1995 report acknowledged the government's failure in protecting its citizens and set the stage for ethical reform in human experimentation. In the shadows of prejudice, the Aversion Project's unseen victims. In the oppressive milieu of apartheid South Africa, a disturbing chapter unfolded, largely unknown and unacknowledged for years. This was the era of the Aversion Project, a sinister program undertaken by the South African Defence Force during the late 1970s and 1980s. Under the guise of medical treatment and psychological research, the military embarked on a harrowing endeavour to cure homosexuality within its ranks, reflecting the era's institutionalized homophobia and bigotry. The architect of this covert operation was Dr. Aubrey Levin, a military psychiatrist stationed at the One Military Hospital in Voortrekkerhoogte near Pretoria. Levin, later infamously known as Dr. Shock, spearheaded a series of brutal experiments and treatments aimed at reversing the affectional preference of conscripted soldiers. These young men, drafted into the military under compulsory national service, found themselves entrapped in a system that deemed their affectional preference as a malady needing rectification. The methods employed in the Aversion Project were as inhumane as they were futile. Electric shock therapy, a controversial and painful technique, was routinely used. Soldiers were subjected to high-voltage shocks while being forced to view same-gender suggestive imagery in a twisted attempt to associate homosexual desire with pain and fear. One victim, who later recounted his experience anonymously, described the process as a living nightmare, a testament to the indelible psychological scars left by these sessions. In some extreme cases, the project resorted to gender reassignment surgeries, performed without the informed consent of the soldiers. These irreversible procedures were carried out under the pretext of aligning the soldiers' physical gender with their perceived, correct affectional preference. The physical and psychological aftermath of such surgeries was profound, leaving the victims grappling with a lifetime of identity crises and health complications. The Aversion Project was not an isolated phenomenon, but indicative of the broader systemic prejudices within the military establishment. Homosexuality was perceived as a threat to the hyper-masculine and rigidly controlled military environment. The psychiatric wards of military hospitals, such as Ward 22 at one military hospital, became secret chambers where these punitive measures were implemented. An officer, reflecting the prevalent attitude, once declared, "We are not interested in curing homosexuals. We are interested in eliminating them from the army." The fall of apartheid in the early 1990s brought these practices to an abrupt end, but the legacy of the Aversion Project lingered, shrouded in silence and denial. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tasked with uncovering the atrocities of the apartheid era, barely scratched the surface of these human rights breaches. Dr. Aubrey Levin, the mastermind behind the project, emigrated to Canada, evading the reckoning that many felt he deserved. The impact of the Aversion Project on its victims was profound and long-lasting. Many suffered in silence, their stories untold and unrecognized in the broader narrative of apartheid's abuses. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the project's full extent began to emerge, bringing to light the depth of suffering endured by the victims. Shadows and Minds, the untold story of MK Ultra. In the 1950s, as the Cold War's chilly fingers curled around the globe, the CIA embarked on one of its most secretive and controversial projects, MK Ultra. This clandestine program, sanctioned in 1953 under CIA Director Allen Dulles and helmed by chemist Sidney Gottlieb, sought to explore the possibilities of mind control as a weapon against the looming communist threat. This endeavor marked a foray into uncharted territory, blending science fiction with espionage in a bid to control the human psyche. MK Ultra's genesis was rooted deeply in Cold War paranoia, an era where the fear of Soviet psychological manipulation techniques gripped the United States. The CIA, desperate to counteract these perceived threats, turned to methods that pushed the boundaries of ethical science. Universities, hospitals, and prisons across the country became unwitting arenas for these experiments, with funding often channeled through front organizations to mask the CIA's involvement. The program's experiments were diverse and often harrowing. LSD, a hallucinogenic drug discovered in the late 1930s by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, became a key tool in these trials. Its effects on the human mind were both profound and unpredictable, making it a subject of intense interest to Gottlieb and his team. One notable incident involved the administration of LSD to Dr. Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biochemist. In 1953, during a retreat at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland, Olson was covertly dosed with LSD by his CIA colleagues. The experience was profoundly disorienting for Olson, leading to a psychological crisis and his subsequent mysterious, tragic end, initially reported as occurring from a New York hotel room. Operation Midnight Climax, another facet of MK Ultra, took the experiments out of the lab and into the real world. In safe houses established in San Francisco, New York, and Marin County, ladies of the night on the CIA's payroll lured unsuspecting men. These men were then dosed with LSD and other substances, while CIA agents observed behind one-way mirrors. These operations, led by Federal Narcotics Bureau agent George White, were as ethically dubious as they were scientifically valuable. White, reflecting on his role, once callously remarked, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" The scale of MK Ultra was staggering. Over 150 sub-projects emerged, spanning various aspects of psychological warfare and mind control. Among the institutions involved was Harvard University, where a young Ted Kaczynski, later known as the Unabomber, was subjected to psychologically distressing experiments under a study led by Dr. Henry Murray. These experiments, which sought to analyze stress responses and personality breakdown, may have played a role in Kaczynski's later actions. The revelation of MK Ultra's activities in the 1970s sent shockwaves through American society. The Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission, in their investigations, uncovered the extent of the CIA's foray into mind control. The public learned of these experiments not through official disclosure, but through the investigative journalism of reporters like Seymour Hersh. This exposure prompted significant backlash against the CIA, leading to reforms and a re-evaluation of ethical standards in intelligence operations. The project's official cessation in 1973 did little to assuage the concerns about its lasting impact. The destruction of most MK Ultra documents in 1973, by order of then CIA Director Richard Helms, hampered efforts to fully understand the program's scope and outcomes. What remained were fragmented accounts and a lingering sense of betrayal among the American public. Echoes of Fear, the tale of Little Albert. In the early 20th century, a psychological experiment took place that would become one of the most discussed and controversial studies in the field of psychology. This was the Little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920 by John B. Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, at Johns Hopkins University. The subject of their experiment was a 9-month-old baby known as Little Albert. The study aimed to investigate classical conditioning, a theory developed by Ivan Pavlov, and its influence on human behavior. Little Albert, a seemingly ordinary infant, was selected from a hospital at which Watson had access. He was initially observed to be a stable and unemotional child, unafraid of animals including rats, which would later play a crucial role in the experiment. Watson and Rayner's objective was to condition a fear response in Little Albert, who at the beginning of the experiment showed no fear towards a white rat. The procedure was simple, yet harrowing. When Little Albert reached out to touch the white rat, Watson would make a loud, frightening noise by striking a metal bar with a hammer right behind the baby's head. The sudden loud sound would naturally startle Albert, causing him to cry. This pairing of the white rat with the frightening noise was repeated several times over the next 7 weeks. Gradually, Little Albert began to associate the white rat with the loud noise, and he would start to cry at the mere sight of the rat, even without the noise. This experiment demonstrated that emotional responses could be conditioned in humans. However, it also raised significant ethical concerns. Little Albert was subjected to psychological stress without his or his parents' consent, and there was no evidence of any effort to desensitize him to the fears that had been artificially instilled in him. The story of Little Albert took a twist when it was revealed that his real name was likely Douglas Merritt. Tragically, Merritt died at the age of 6 from hydrocephalus, and it was speculated that his participation in the experiment might have contributed to his condition, although this remains unproven. The legacy of the Little Albert experiment is complex. On one hand, it was a groundbreaking study that significantly contributed to the understanding of conditioning and phobias. On the other, it stands as a prime example of ethical malpractice in psychological research. Watson, known as the father of behaviorism, was undeterred by the ethical implications. He famously stated, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select." In subsequent years, the experiment has been the subject of much debate and scrutiny. The ethics of using such a young child, the long-term effects on Little Albert, and the lack of any form of consent or debriefing were all points of criticism. The experiment's methodology and results have also been questioned, with some researchers arguing that Albert's reactions were not as clear-cut as Watson and Rayner suggested. Shadows of betrayal, the Guatemala syphilis experiments. In the lingering shadow of World War II, a covert and ethically reprehensible medical experiment was conducted far from the battlefields. Between 1946 and 1948, in the tropical climes of Guatemala, a dark narrative of medical exploitation unfolded. Orchestrated by the U.S. Public Health Service, the Guatemala syphilis experiments ensnared unwitting subjects, including prisoners, mental health patients, and soldiers, in a study that sought to understand the transmission and treatment of diseases passed through close contact, particularly syphilis. Dr. John C. Cutler, a physician with the U.S. Public Health Service and a prominent figure in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, played a pivotal role in these experiments. With the tacit approval of the Guatemalan government, Cutler and his team embarked on their scientific pursuit, shrouded in the guise of medical advancement. The National Mental Health Hospital in Guatemala City and the local penitentiary became the primary sites for these experiments, where the most vulnerable populations were chosen as subjects. The methodology employed was shockingly invasive and morally indefensible. The research team, in their pursuit to induce syphilis, resorted to methods such as introducing the bacteria directly into the subjects' bodies or facilitating encounters with ladies of the night known to be infected with the disease. The subjects, unaware of the true nature of the experiments, were subsequently observed for the development of symptoms. Their suffering, documented in clinical notes, was devoid of empathy. Cutler, in a correspondence, casually noted, "We are planning on inoculating soldiers with syphilis in Guatemala." Over 1,300 individuals fell victim to these experiments, and many suffered grievously as a result. While some subjects received penicillin treatment, the adequacy and effectiveness of these interventions were questionable. The lack of informed consent and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for the sake of scientific inquiry exemplified the ethical breaches of the study. The story of these experiments remained buried for decades, a hidden chapter in the annals of medical history, until their exposure in 2010 by medical historian Susan M. Reverby. Her discovery of Cutler's detailed records in archives brought to light the extent of the atrocities committed. The revelations prompted an apology from US President Barack Obama to Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom, with Obama condemning the experiments as a dark chapter in American history. He acknowledged, "The United States deeply regrets the suffering and harm to individuals, a rare presidential admission of historical wrongdoing." Behind closed cells, the unraveling of the Stanford prison experiment. In the quiet corridors of Stanford University in the summer of 1971, an experiment was conducted that would profoundly question the depths of human nature and the impact of situational forces on behavior. The Stanford prison experiment, orchestrated by psychologist Dr. Philip Zimbardo, sought to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power, focusing on the struggle between prisoners and prison officers. This study, originally slated to last 2 weeks, was abruptly halted after just 6 days due to the alarming psychological transformations that unfolded. The experiment began with an advertisement seeking male volunteers for a study of prison life, offering $15 per day for participation. From the pool of applicants, 24 men were chosen, deemed the most psychologically stable and healthy. These individuals were randomly assigned roles of either prisoners or guards and were immersed in a mock prison environment set up in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual police officers and subjected to typical booking procedures before being transported to the mock prison. This initiation into the experiment immediately set a tone of realism and authority. The guards, equipped with uniforms, nightsticks, and mirrored sunglasses, were given free rein to maintain order, provided they did not resort to physical violence. Quickly, the situation escalated beyond expectations. The guards began to exhibit authoritarian and even sadistic behavior, devising creative and psychological methods to control and dehumanize the prisoners. These tactics included sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, and forcing prisoners to wear bags over their heads. Zimbardo, who also took on the role of the prison superintendent, observed the rapid descent of the experiment into chaos. One of the most striking transformations was observed in a guard known as John Wayne, real name Dave Eshelman, who adopted a particularly harsh and sadistic role. His behavior, as recounted by Zimbardo, was a dramatic amplification of the authority role, leading to the infamous Night of the Broken Glass, where guards harassed and psychologically tormented the prisoners. The prisoners responded to the oppressive environment with a mix of rebellion and passivity. The simulated prison environment had become a psychological trap for both guards and prisoners, blurring the lines between role-playing and real internalized identities. One of the most striking incidents involved the so-called rebellion by the prisoners. Just 2 days into the experiment, the prisoners barricaded themselves in their cells, leading to a forceful response by the guards who used fire extinguishers to regain control. This event marked a significant escalation in the guards' willingness to exert control through increasingly aggressive means. The psychological impact on the participants was profound. Prisoners began to exhibit signs of severe emotional distress, including crying, acute anxiety, and disorientation. One participant, assigned the role of a prisoner, began to exhibit signs of a mental breakdown within 36 hours, leading to his early release. Reflecting on the experience, Zimbardo noted, "Only a few people were able to resist the situational temptations to yield to power and dominance while maintaining their morality and decency. Most did not." Zimbardo, initially serving as an observer, found himself drawn into the experiment's dynamics, adopting the role of a prison superintendent. This loss of objectivity was a critical turning point. As he later admitted, "I had become the superintendent of a madhouse." The experiment's abrupt end came at the insistence of Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD graduate and Zimbardo's then-girlfriend. Horrified by the guard's abusive behavior during a visit, she confronted Zimbardo, stating, "What you are doing to those boys is a terrible thing." Her intervention was the catalyst for Zimbardo to recognize the ethical implications and the psychological harm being inflicted. The Stanford prison experiment raised critical questions about the nature of human behavior, particularly the ease with which ordinary individuals could engage in acts of tyranny when placed in a position of authority within a dehumanizing environment. The blurred lines between role-playing and real identity in the experiment showed the powerful influence of situational factors on behavior. Whispered echoes, the tragic tale of the monster study. In the serene city of Davenport, Iowa, a disturbing experiment unfolded in 1939, away from the world's prying eyes. This was the setting for the infamous monster study, a psychological experiment that would leave an indelible scar on the lives of its subjects. Conducted at the University of Iowa by Wendell Johnson, an esteemed speech pathologist, and his graduate student Mary Tudor, the study embarked on a controversial journey to understand the genesis of stuttering. Johnson, who himself struggled with stuttering, was driven by a deep desire to unravel this speech impediment's mysteries. The study, conducted at the orphanage of stuttering children, was predicated on the hypothesis that stuttering was a learned behavior, a result of a child's environment and not a physiological condition. The chosen venue for this experiment was an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, where the lives of 22 innocent children were unknowingly and irrevocably altered. These children, seeking comfort and care in the orphanage, were instead subjected to a study that would challenge their very perception of speech and self. The experiment was split into two groups. The first consisted of children who already had a stutter. These children received positive speech therapy, where their efforts at communication were met with encouragement and praise. The second group, where the ethical boundaries were significantly breached, consisted of children who did not stutter. Tudor, under Johnson's guidance, subjected these children to negative speech therapy, constantly criticizing their speech and sowing seeds of self-doubt. This group, referred to as the experimental group, became the core of Johnson's investigation. The impact of this negative therapy was immediate and devastating. Children who had never stuttered before began to show signs of speech impediments. Their confidence shattered. Many withdrew into a shell, hesitant to speak, fearing ridicule and embarrassment. A former subject, recalling the trauma, said, "I started to stutter after those tests at the university. I never did before. It ruined my life." As weeks turned into months, the changes in these children became more pronounced. Tudor's notes, chilling in their clinical detachment, observed the deterioration in their speech. One child, originally a fluent speaker, was described as becoming increasingly hesitant, often freezing before speaking. Johnson, whose famous quote, "Stuttering is what you do when you try to avoid stuttering," ironically underscored the unintended consequences of his own study. The ethical implications of the study were profound. Johnson, driven by scientific curiosity, had seemingly overlooked the psychological welfare of his subjects. The study, later dubbed the Monster Study, became a haunting example of the consequences of research devoid of ethical considerations. The ramifications of the experiment extended far beyond its conclusion. Many of the children, now adults, spoke of the lasting impact the study had on their lives. The loss of confidence, the reluctance to engage in social interactions, and the stigma of a stutter that was artificially induced haunted them for years. It wasn't until decades later, in the 2000s, that the story of the monster study came to light, shocking the academic and psychological communities. The University of Iowa, grappling with the legacy of this experiment, issued a formal apology in 2001, acknowledging the suffering caused to the participants. Wendell Johnson, a respected figure in the study of speech pathology, remained a divisive character. Despite his significant contributions to the field, his legacy was forever tarnished by the ethical transgressions of the monster study. His pursuit of knowledge, albeit groundbreaking, came at an unconscionable cost to the very subjects he sought to understand. The monster study stands as a poignant reminder of the ethical responsibilities inherent in scientific research. It underscores the necessity of prioritizing the welfare and dignity of research subjects, especially when they are as vulnerable as children. In the words of Mary Tudor, reflecting on her role in the study, "I wish I could undo it, but I can't. I feel very badly about my part in it." Her remorse speaks volumes about the moral quandaries that researchers must navigate in their quest for knowledge. Echoes of Sacrifice, the hidden saga of mustard gas trials. In the shadows of military history, obscured by the fog of war and the passage of time, lies the tale of the US military's mustard gas experiments. These trials, conducted from the 1920s through World War II, were a part of a clandestine effort to understand and prepare for chemical warfare, a looming threat in the global military landscape. The journey into this covert chapter begins in the interwar period, a time when memories of mustard gas use in World War I were still vivid in the minds of military strategists. Seeking to bolster the nation's defenses against this insidious weapon, the US military initiated a series of experiments that would span decades and impact countless lives. The Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. became pivotal locations in this endeavor. Here, young servicemen, often uninformed of the full implications, were exposed to mustard gas in a variety of settings, from open fields to enclosed chambers. These servicemen, many in their late teens or early 20s, epitomized the patriotic fervor of the era. They were assured that their participation was crucial to national security, a notion that resonated deeply in the post-World War I landscape. The trials varied in severity, but all shared a common trait: the exposure to mustard gas, a substance known for its blistering and suffocating effects. The immediate aftermath was often agonizing, as recounted by one veteran. "It felt like my skin was on fire and my lungs were about to collapse." His words echo the physical and emotional trauma experienced by many participants. The toll of these experiments was not just immediate, but long-lasting. Veterans often found themselves grappling with chronic health issues, ranging from respiratory problems to recurrent skin conditions. Yet for years their stories remained untold, their sacrifices unrecognized, hidden beneath the veil of military secrecy. As the decades passed, the true extent of these mustard gas experiments began to emerge. The lifting of the veil in the late 20th century revealed the scale and impact of these trials. Veterans, now aging, came forward with their stories, painting a vivid picture of their experiences and suffering. It was a revelation that prompted both shock and introspection about the nature of military research and the treatment of those who serve. A particularly unsettling aspect of these experiments was the targeted inclusion of minority servicemen. African American, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican soldiers were disproportionately represented, often chosen because of prevalent racial biases and the misguided belief that they were more resistant to pain and chemicals. This selection process added a layer of racial discrimination to the ethical breaches of the experiments. The unseen scars of Project 4.1. In the serene blue waters of the Pacific, a narrative of sorrow and science unfolded, hidden from the world's gaze. This was the story of Project 4.1, a secretive study conducted by the United States in the aftermath of the Castle Bravo nuclear test on March 1, 1954. The test, which took place on the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, was the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated by the United States at that time. Unknown to many, it also became the catalyst for an unforeseen human experiment involving the residents of the Marshall Islands. Project 4.1 began as an unplanned consequence of the Castle Bravo test, which unexpectedly exposed the residents of nearby atolls, including Rongelap and Utirik, to radioactive fallout. The inhabitants experienced acute radiation sickness, their lives unknowingly entwined with a scientific study of radiation exposure's long-term effects. The project derived its name from its designation in the Castle Bravo operational plan. 4.1 referred to the study of radioactive contamination on human beings. The Castle Bravo explosion was far more powerful than scientists had predicted, yielding 15 megatons, over twice the expected force. The miscalculation led to an unexpected wind shift that carried radioactive fallout to the Rongelap and Utirik atolls, about 100 miles east of the test site. Within hours, the inhabitants living their customary lives were showered with a fine, powdery ash, marking the beginning of a tragic chapter in their history. The immediate effects of the fallout were severe. People suffered from nausea, vomiting, and burns on their skin. Hair loss followed, and the once pristine environment they called home became a silent testament to nuclear devastation. The US government, realizing the severity of the situation, initiated Project 4.1 to study the medical effects of radiation exposure on these unintended victims. Dr. Robert Conard, a physician with the US Atomic Energy Commission, led the medical team that first arrived at Rongelap and Utirik. The residents were subjected to rigorous medical examinations, blood tests, and body fluid collections. These examinations continued for decades, turning the islanders into involuntary subjects of a long-term study on radiation's effects. The islanders, unaware of the full extent of their role in this scientific narrative, refer to Dr. Conard and his team as the Tombstone Doctors, a stark reflection of their fear and the grim reality they faced. What ensued in the following years was a life of uncertainty and upheaval for the islanders. They were relocated multiple times, their health continuously monitored and studied by American scientists. The long-term effects were devastating. Increased rates of thyroid disorders, miscarriages, and cancers were observed in the population. The legacy of radiation exposure was not just a series of physical ailments, but a profound alteration of a community's way of life. The ethical implications of Project 4.1 are deeply troubling. The residents of the Marshall Islands, unwitting participants in a study of nuclear fallout, were never adequately informed or consented to this prolonged observation. Their plight was later summed up in a haunting quote from a Rongelapese leader who said, "We were guinea pigs. They used us just to study the effects of radiation." As we close this somber journey through some of the darkest corridors of human experimentation, we are reminded of the haunting legacy left behind by these studies. From the chilling endeavors of Dr. Josef Mengele in Auschwitz during World War II to the cold, calculating procedures of Unit 731 during the Second Sino-Japanese War, these experiments are stark reminders of the depths to which humanity can sink in the name of science and progress. As we reflect on these moments, a quote from the Nuremberg trials, which judged the war crimes of the Nazi era, resonates powerfully. The rights of individuals are not subordinate to the interests of science. These words, uttered in the aftermath of some of the most horrific experiments in human history, continue to echo as a guiding principle in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The legacy of these experiments serves as a sobering reminder of the critical importance of ethical standards in research. They underscore the need for constant vigilance to ensure that the quest for knowledge never again overshadows the fundamental principles of humanity and respect for human dignity. As we look back at these chapters of history, let us commit to a future where the echoes of the past guide us toward a more ethical and humane approach to scientific inquiry.